What if we could step into a parallel past, one that history books left behind? Let's turn the pages and uncover the dark truths they never wanted us to see.
In 1959, 9 experienced hikers vanished in the Ural Mountains. Days later, their bodies were found, some frozen, others brutally crushed, one missing her tongue and eyes. The Soviet Union sealed the case, declaring it an unexplained natural disaster. But what really happened that night? This is not just a story. This is the truth they buried. January 23, 1959, Sverdlovsk, Soviet Union. Outside the train window, an endless expanse of white covered the land. The iron tracks twisted and stretched across the frozen tundra, leading toward what felt like an abyss of silence. Steam from the locomotive curled into the frigid air, briefly fogging up the glass and distorting my view of the distant horizon. My name is Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a student at the Moscow Institute of Engineering, and the leader of this expedition. We were a team of 9 explorers, young, ambitious, and eager to conquer the mysterious peak of Mount Otterton, deep within the Ural Mountains. In the language of the indigenous Mansai people, Otterton means the place you must not go. But instead of warning us away, it felt more like a challenge, a beckoning invitation. The others sat in a loose circle within the cramped train compartment, passing around a bottle of vodka, singing loud Soviet folk songs between bursts of laughter. Igor, have you ever heard the Mansi legend? Zolotaryov, the oldest in our group, broke the noise with his calm voice. A former soldier, he carried an air of quiet authority, his expression always tinged with a peculiar detachment. What legend? I asked, swallowing the last sip of vodka. The warmth burned my throat, momentarily shielding me from the cold. He set his cup down slowly, his gaze drifting past the frosted window, into the vast, lifeless white beyond. The Mansi say that shadow creatures live on Mount Otterton, he murmured. They do not belong to our world. Anyone who hears their whispers at night never returns. His voice was like the wind on a winter's night, soft, cold, yet somehow chilling to the bone. Bullshit, Udina, the only woman in our group, scoffed, rolling her eyes. Primitive superstition. We have maps, compasses, and rifles. What could possibly happen to us? You ever think, what if the legend is true? Doroshenko, usually the jokester, spoke up hesitantly. A shadow of doubt flickered across his face. What if something really is out there? Then we'll take a picture of it and bring it back to the Academy of Sciences, I cut in with a grin, slapping him on the shoulder. Don't let fear consume you, comrade. We're mountaineers. We believe in science. At the time, I truly believed that. I had no idea that on that frozen tundra, science had no explanation for what we were about to experience. We traveled further north. The train carried us to its final stop, after which we boarded an old truck, riding deep into the mountains until we reached a small, isolated Mansi village. The Mansi were a nomadic people, their wooden huts scattered at the forest's edge, where thin trails of smoke rose into the pale sky, silent, eerie signals against the bitter cold. We only planned to stay briefly, just long enough to resupply before heading toward Otterton. After purchasing food and supplies, we noticed an old man standing by one of the wooden houses watching us. His gaze wasn't hostile, but it carried an inexplicable weight, something between fear and resignation. Otterton, I said when he asked where we were going. The old man inhaled sharply. His lips quivered as though he wanted to speak, but in the end he only lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the horizon. His voice was hoarse, dry. That place does not belong to humans. Then, without another word, he turned and walked into his house. The door slammed shut with a heavy finality. For a moment, none of us spoke. We just exchanged uneasy glances, each waiting for someone else to dismiss the old man's words. Udina finally broke the silence with a chuckle. Come on, old legends to scare outsiders? They're messing with us. The others laughed, shaking off the tension. The wind was growing heavier, colder, but we wasted no more time. We moved forward. We never took the old man's warning seriously, but that was the last chance we had to turn back. By afternoon, we finally reached the mountain slope where we planned to set up camp. The sky was a dull gray and the wind had grown much stronger. Originally, we planned to camp in the forest below, where the trees would provide some protection from the wind, but in the end, we decided to stay here on the open slope. The sun sank behind the mountains. The temperature dropped rapidly. The wind sharpened, whistling through the valleys like a blade. We worked quickly, stacking blocks of snow into a protective barrier against the wind, securing the tent with tight knots. By the time the last rope was fastened, the world had plunged into complete darkness. Inside the tent, we huddled together, our breath forming small clouds in the icy air. The campfire had long since burned out, leaving only the dim, flickering beams of our flashlights, casting restless shadows against the canvas. I woke up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. Crunch, crunch. Like someone trudging slowly through the snow. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath and sat up carefully. Everyone else was still asleep, except for Zolotaryov. His eyes were open, alert, fixed on the tent entrance. "You hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, saying nothing, but his fingers tightened around the handle of his ice axe. Crunch. Crunch. The sound was growing closer. I carefully lifted the edge of the tent, just enough to shine my flashlight outside. The wind warped the landscape, distorting the distant snowfield. At first I saw nothing. Then, just as the beam of light flickered away, something was standing there. A tall, misshapen silhouette standing motionless in the snow. It was twisted, unnatural, as if light itself bent around it, refusing to fully illuminate its form. I blinked. It was gone. Then, a few minutes later, the footsteps returned, closer this time, and this time I saw its face. Terror seized my body. The footsteps stopped. Outside the tent, the blizzard roared, but underneath it, everything else was too quiet. It was standing just outside, no more than 5 meters away. I gripped my ice axe. Zolotaryov's hand trembled slightly. He was a former soldier. He had faced war, but he had never seen anything like this. Then we heard the whispering. "Ooh, Gert, ooh." Not a human language. A low, distorted gurgling as if something was trying to mimic speech, but failing. The whispering grew louder, closer. Then, a hand touched the tent. A long, pale hand, fingers impossibly stretched, almost twice the length of a human's. The skin was lifeless gray, the joints unnaturally stiff. It slowly traced across the fabric, like it was checking if we were awake. "Don't move," Zolotaryov whispered. But my hand trembled. It felt it. The whispering stopped. Then, rip, the tent was torn open from the inside. My foot sank into the deep snow. The cold bit through my bare skin like 1,000 needles, but I didn't dare stop. I could hear it behind us. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, not rushing but following. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. The blizzard swallowed our screams, turning them into muffled echoes. Around me, the shadows of my teammates flickered in and out of sight, silhouettes against the storm. Then, Udina screamed. I turned. It was right behind her. Or at least something was. It was too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched at unnatural angles, and though the storm obscured its features, I could see its mouth, grinning, stretching far too wide, teeth sharp and glistening like wet bone. And its eyes, no, not eyes, but empty sockets, deep and hollow. It didn't pounce. It didn't lunge. Instead, it tilted its head as if studying her. Udina's breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes locked onto its face. Her mouth trembled, but no words came out. Then her nose started bleeding. A trickle at first, then more, until red streaked down her pale skin. "Udina!" Zolotaryov grabbed her arm and yanked her away. She collapsed, her body convulsing violently in the snow. That thing took a single step forward. Just one. I didn't think. I just ran. We crashed through the tree line, blindly running into the forest below the mountain ridge. The wind was screaming. Or maybe that wasn't the wind. There was no plan, no destination, just the desperate need to get away. We stumbled down the slope, our feet slipping, tumbling into the valley below. By the time we stopped, our bodies were frozen, our breath coming in ragged sobs. I turned to count. 7. We had lost 2. I couldn't even remember when they had fallen behind. Zolotaryov collapsed against a tree, clutching at his chest, his breath coming out in pained gasps. "What the hell is that thing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just looked up at me, his face pale, lips chapped and cracking. "It's playing with us." I shivered, not from the cold, but from something much deeper. "Now what?" one of the others muttered, their voice shaking. There was no answer. The snow stretched in every direction, a lifeless white abyss. Then, in the distance, light, a faint glowing orange pulse from beyond the next ridge. It flickered, unnatural, almost like a signal. "What the hell is that?" Zolotaryov's hands clenched into fists. That's not the sun. I stared at the eerie glow, a horrible certainty sinking into my gut. This wasn't just a blizzard. This wasn't just some wild animal. Something was happening in these mountains, and we had walked straight into it. The temperature had dropped even further. We tried to build a fire, but the wind was too strong. We huddled together, desperate for warmth, our bodies shivering uncontrollably. One by one, they started losing consciousness. At first, I thought they were sleeping, just closing their eyes, trying to block out the nightmare. But then, I noticed how still they were. No shivering, no movement, just the wind howling through the ravine. I shook Zolotaryov's shoulder. "Hey, stay awake." He opened his eyes barely. His breath came in slow, ragged gulps. "Igor." His voice was hoarse. "It's still out there." I swallowed hard. I didn't ask him how he knew. I already felt it too. Somewhere in the darkness, it was waiting, watching. The next thing I remember was waking up. I was lying in the snow, half buried, my limbs so numb that I couldn't feel my own body. I tried to move, but I wasn't alone. The wind had stopped. The silence was absolute. And then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, right next to me. Something crouched down. I felt its breath, a freezing gust against my exposed skin. Then, in my ear, a whisper.
"You shouldn't have come."
I blacked out. Weeks later, they found us. The search team had been sent after we missed our scheduled return. They found our torn tent first, half buried in the snow. Then the bodies, 6 of them. They were naked, curled up in the snow, frozen solid. Some had crushed ribs as if something had squeezed the life out of them. One had no tongue, no eyes, but I was still alive. Barely. I don't know how I survived. I don't know why it let me live. They never let me tell the truth. The moment I was strong enough to speak, the authorities arrived. They didn't ask what happened. They didn't want to know. They handed me a document. Sign it. It was a confidentiality agreement. You saw nothing. You were caught in a blizzard. The others froze to death. You are the only survivor. If I refused, I knew I would never leave that hospital alive. So I signed it. The officer took the paper, pocketed it, and before walking away, he smiled. "Are you sure you were the only survivor?" My breath caught in my throat. I opened my mouth to answer, but he had already turned and left. Even now, years later, I still dream of that night. In my dreams, I stand in the snow. The tent is torn open behind me. The wind howls, but beneath it, I hear something else. A voice, low, guttural, inhuman, whispering, "Oh, Ga-ra." It is still there, waiting, and I know, one day, it will come back for me.